Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing Astrology in Medieval Manuscripts by Sophie Page. This book is in the series that is like blank in Medieval Manuscripts, which introduce a topic that is present and found in medieval manuscripts through a blend of the actual manuscript text and the art that is found within the manuscript. These are pretty short books, but they are filled with plenty of art and a really good solid introduction to the topic at hand. I have read Magic in Medieval Manuscripts, also by Sophie Page, and Monsters and Grotesques by Alex Bovey. Both of those videos will be linked at the end of this video, but today I am tackling Astrology in Medieval Manuscripts, the third one in this series that I have read, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm going to talk about what you can expect and what I learned from this book, as well as some thoughts overall on this book as a whole. So this is my second book by Sophie Page, so I kind of was familiar also with the series and I've read something by the author before. And just to start out, because I know astrology is still present in today's society, I'm not really an astrology girl, so I'm approaching this with a level of skepticism, just so you're aware of where I stand. However, astrology was viewed in the Middle Ages very differently than we view astrology today. Today, we separate out the science of astronomy, which is the science of the heavens, of space, of stars, and the movements of bodies within it, and astrology, which we view as more of a personal belief and in some cases superstition. We have the horoscopes, you have all the gossip magazines telling you how you can expect your crush to act this month due to where the stars are. It's not something I follow, but it does still have a following today. In the Middle Ages, though, these two were linked. So astronomy and astrology were closely intertwined, and having read this book, I really understand why they were intertwined, and we'll get to that in a minute. These were viewed both as scientifically rigorous and acceptable ways sometimes of going about life, and it was a huge part in medieval life, in the medieval mind, and it found its way, of course, in the important manuscripts of this time, which is what we are going to be discussing in this book by Sophie Page. So astronomy reached the Middle Ages in kind of two different phases. So astrology has been part of human history since recorded time. We have it in the Babylonians, in the Egyptian texts. So this is a science, for lack of a better term, that has existed for a while. And so it also went through the Greco-Roman tradition, but after the fall of Rome, it kind of went dark in the Middle Ages. What did survive initially was kind of viewed skeptically by the church, but as happened with a lot of text and a lot of knowledge in those dark periods, or that time after the fall of the Roman Empire, the knowledge actually went to the Arab world where it was preserved, and particularly for this astrology, but also in other fields like mathematics, there was some mixing from sources like India. So there has been this mixing of what was previously established in the Greco-Roman world, also stemming from more ancient sources, with the Indian traditions, and this mixing in that crossroad that was the Arab world. And this form of astrology also made its way back, and that form seems to have a little bit more acceptance. But as we see again and again through this book, astrology was really starting to walk this fine line between what was accepted by the church and what was unacceptable. So there was this tension between perhaps using astrology for unintended consequences. So for divination, in the sense that maybe you were going to be consorting with demons. And there was some pictures in here of the medieval astrologer maybe going a little bit too far. Texts that seem to indicate, here's one, that maybe they were consorting with things they shouldn't to reach these texts. But there was also a scientific backing to this because astrology was also tightly linked with astronomy. And there was also this idea that it may be acceptable to gain knowledge, and it was well within the Christian theology of the time and the view of the world that the celestial bodies did have an impact on what was happening on Earth. So the church did not frown on everything. Here we see a Christian theological view of the world at the time with, of course, Earth in the center. It wasn't totally outside the realm of Christian theology, astrology, but at times it did walk a very fine line that the astrologers had to be careful of. So the reason I think it wasn't entirely rejected is because there was that tight intertwining between two fields which we now separate today. So as I read this book, I went in knowing that these two fields were closely tied, but in my mind, I was still coming from it from a modern perspective in which astrology is just the horoscopes and the prediction of the future and telling you if your crush is going to like you this month due to where Mercury is in what house. And I wasn't understanding that these fields were as tightly entwined as they were. And as you read this book, a lot of the texts that are provided show the calculations that were done. So there was a lot of intense calculations that truly fall more into astronomy that were used to link the field of astronomy and astrology. So we have very detailed calculations of the locations of stars and planets, and there's a lot of very scientific and truly scientific in the way we would determine that word today to be calculations that were being done. The link came from these, what we maybe today call astronomical calculations. The link came when these astronomical calculations were being used and applied to astrology to say, based on these calculations that we have done using real measurements of what's happening in the heavens, what can we determine is going to happen in the world below? And that's where that link between astronomy and astrology came in. But having read this book, I really understand how the medieval mind quickly was able to tie these two fields together, or it truly feels like one field. It truly felt like we can measure this, and because of these intense measurements, it kind of lends itself an air of legitimacy because you can quite literally measure these things and you can see, is this planet really in this section of the sky? So you understand how tightly linked these fields were, and you can see all of the calculations and charts and diagrams that are amply provided in this series, which I really love. I love this blank in Medieval Manuscript series because you have a lot of visuals, and I find that visuals are very, very helpful. So there were two types of astrology that were discussed in here, and I'm sure if you read a more intense book, it would get into the details. But the practice of astrology is this chapter which talks about the difference between mundane astrology and judicial astrology. And mundane astrology was much more accepted. Judicial is where you started to run into maybe some questions from the church wondering what you were doing. Mundane was just truly interested in the celestial influence on nature. And I think another reason why this could have been accepted is due to some things that really do influence things on Earth. The moon influences the tide, and this is a clear connection from what you're seeing in the sky impacting something on Earth. So it makes sense that maybe in the medieval mind, maybe if the last time this star was here there was a massive flood, maybe it was that position in the sky that caused this flood. You can see how there could be a through line of explanation in these astrological calculations. So the mundane was quite simply just how natural phenomena were interacting with the celestial things in the sky. And that seems to be accepted by the church. There wasn't too much pushback, at least from, again, this is a very, very high level introduction. That seemed to be the one that was more accepted. Judicial is the kind that was maybe a little bit more frowned upon because the judicial astrology was very much focused, and I'll read the definition on page 30, on the individual, and provided more specific predictions for an individual life and the correct time for performing an action. It therefore came under suspicion from medieval churchmen who saw it as presenting a threat to the concept of free will and the divine providence of God. And a common response from astrologers to this criticism was that the wise man ruled the stars, and foreknowledge of events eased their impact and enabled man to prepare for disaster. So this is where we start to get into divination, attempting to read the future, and things that maybe the Catholic Church was keeping an eye on. And the judicial astrology falls into three subcategories: the natal astrology or nativity horoscope, and that is the one that is most commonly practiced even today, which is where you were born, how you were born, under what star sign you were born. Many people know their star sign even if they don't follow astrology today. So that one is still popular today, and I think we have a clear understanding of what natal astrology is. But also horary, Horary, that is interrogational, and also electional astrology. So there were three subcategories under judicial, and they were all grouped under the category of trying to figure out what was going on in the future, how your kid was going to turn out, maybe prime professions for them, and whether or not they would be wealthy, honest, fall into any of those categories, trying to determine the future, which is a very normal human impulse, I find. The one thing I found interesting from this section that really tied back to that first section I talked about, the history and preservation of astrology, is that horary or the interrogative astrology in that apparently did not come from Greco-Roman sources. So this was a form of astrology that didn't exist in maybe those original sources, but it was one that was entered in when this knowledge was preserved in the Arab world and mixed with the Indian knowledge that was coming from the Indian subcontinent. And that came into this form, this interrogative form, and then that moved to the Middle Ages. And of course, this also fell into one of the types of astrology that was more suspect. So the three types are discussed in that section, and we can kind of see which forms of astrology the church was okay with, which ones were very common to be found in a court, and which ones were maybe more frowned upon and might lead to trouble. The last couple sections of the book discuss the role of astrology in medieval society and whether or not the layperson, how they interacted with that as opposed to maybe kings, courts, and officials, as well as the role astrology played in medieval medicine, which is also a whole fascinating topic. My thoughts of this book overall, I love this entry in the series. It is, of course, very, very high level, so it's very focused on the big picture and not so focused on the details. So if you like the details, you're not completely out of luck. There is, of course, a bibliography section where you can go to read more information, but overall you're going to only get the high-level detail, and that's why I said when we went into these types of astrology, I felt like there was a lot more there that the author just kind of rushed through, but the author is also trying to give an introduction and not get stuck wading through all these different murky subcategories that are probably just mostly of interest to the academics in the field. So it is high level, but it is an interesting introduction to the topic, and it gives you enough information that if you want to go read about this topic further, you can take this and read about the topic on your own, follow different ideas or concepts that were interesting in this book, and go find your own reading to continue on this topic. In all of these series, I find that the art takes center stage over the text. The text is just there to provide some information and background, and the art is really where you're going to spend a lot of time. Basically, every single page has art in this book, and you're going to want to take a lot of time to review the art and enjoy the art, and I find that the art is really where these books shine. But overall, it was a fantastic, good introduction, another entry in this series. And if you're interested in learning about how astrology was viewed in the Middle Ages, how it was practiced, and the way that the role that it played in medieval society, this Astrology in Medieval Manuscripts could be a great introduction for you. And of course, if you like this format, you can also check out the Magic in Medieval Manuscripts by Sophie Page and Monsters and Grotesques by Alex Bovey, linked at the end of this video, because those are also really great, fantastic entries in this series. If you have any thoughts or comments on this book that you would like to share, please put it in the comment section down below. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day.